A bronze hinge squeals, a lamp smokes, and a senator steadies his breath. Silver bowls glitter like moons adrift, while servants move with rehearsed, reverent quiet. Laughter travels the table, thin and delayed, as if permission must arrive first. Eyes avoid eyes. Everyone studies the emperor, reading weather from his smallest gesture. The feast is a ledger, bodies and favors tallied beside wines and oiled meats. Power here does not ask obedience only. It wants awe, tribute, and visible trembling. What does power look like when it wants to be worshipped, not merely obeyed? A girl is praised, a husband praised louder, and both understand the price of praise. Tonight's spectacle redraws decency's border. Tomorrow, every doorway learns a new kind of silence. Ancient sources report the scene differently, yet all agree on the suffocating choreography. A senator smiles too slowly, a cup pauses midair. The room hears the pause. The message is simple. Survival requires performance, and performance requires witnesses and stage. To grasp how this theater was built, walk backward to a nickname born in boots. Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus learned to march before he learned to argue about law. Along the Rhine, soldiers knelt to lace his miniature Caligula, laughing, "Little boot, Caligula." Camp humor was tender and noisy. Rome's palace humor was careful, sharpened, conditional. His father Germanicus glittered with popularity, then died, far from home, leaving rumors like ashes. Grief turned instructive. Applause could vanish overnight, and loyalty could curdle into accusation. Agrippina the Elder fought storms of suspicion. Exile nipped at doorways. Visitors counted footsteps. A child watched adults calculate sentences, mastering silence the way others practice instruments. Ancient sources differ on motives and blame, yet agree the household breathed under surveillance. Is a child who studies fear already studying government, its rituals, and its disguises? He learned that survival wears masks, and masks must fit so well they melt. That lesson would have a near consequence. He could perform loyalty with perfect, glittering timing. When Tiberius died in 37, the masks paid off. Dawn broke golden over Rome. Crowds roared for Gaius, calling the name once whispered in tents, now shouted in marble. And with celebration came expectation. Could the hopeful morning last or darken before the wine cooled? Rome woke to relief. Amnesties announced, spectacles funded, and taxes briefly eased. Confiscated estates were reviewed. Exiles saw doors unclasp. Treason trials paused like a bad dream. He kissed infants in porticos, walked among crowds, and waved with an almost theatrical modesty. Temples filled with smoke and gratitude. Coined eyes struck a softer portrait, youthful and open. Courtiers recalculated allegiances as fast as coiners hammered already behind palace walls. Was this the ruler who would stitch the empire's nerves back together after Tiberius? Ancient sources agree on the jubilation, though motives and measures differ, sometimes wildly. He paid arrears to the guard, banked applause, and converted mercy into political credit. That credit spent quickly because mercy breeds appetite for favors, for nearness, for visible devotion. Patrician houses rehearsed gratitude. Petitions were sung like hymns. The city learned new choreography. A caution: early brightness in imperial reigns often reflects relief more than reform. Near consequence, expectations inflated to the ceiling, making any hesitation feel like betrayal. The palace air thickened with offers and warnings, both perfumed, both binding like ribbon. When illness arrived, the city's hope would stumble, and smiles would harden into masks. To understand that swerve, follow the emperor into a dim chamber, sweating under fever. The fever came fast. Convulsions, whispers, and prayers promised at every altar in reach. Rome held its breath. Courtiers vowed statues and games if the gods would spare him. He recovered, pale and sharper, greeting the city with a smile that didn't quite land. Some said the illness gilded him with destiny. Others said it burned away restraint. Ancient sources report different timings and symptoms, but agree a pivot took hold. Is survival, after touching the edge, a license to demand worship rather than obedience? He spoke of himself beside gods, not beneath them, and staged gestures to match. Petitions became liturgies. Praise required volume. The audience was never allowed to blink. A caution: deification and policy are often braided, each justifying the excess of the other. Near consequence, rituals grew costlier, and proximity to the throne required costlier performances. Where fear meets ceremony, boundaries between sacred and profane thin then tear without notice. That tear bled into bedrooms, dining halls, and law courts, turning preference into command. Tomorrow's Rome would learn that appetite could be written as ordinance, and ordinance as theater. To see how power weaponizes desire, step into the new script where pleasure is policy. Next, watch how a private vocabulary became the empire's public language of control. Preference became instruction, and instruction arrived dressed as gifts, compliments, and invitations to linger. Requests blurred into orders when refusal threatened rank, income, or a family's fragile protection. Ancient accounts disagree on names and dates, yet align on the choreography of compulsion. How do you keep consent meaningful when proximity itself is graded, priced, and performed? Desire turned into a timetable. Audiences were arranged. Responses were tallied like tax receipts. Men learned to endorse what they feared, because praise purchased tomorrow's safety for their households. Women were displayed as proof of loyalty. Husbands posed as hosts to their own undoing. The immediate result was transactional intimacy, a marketplace where touch and access carried tariffs. Courtiers devised private signals, rubs of the ring, measured coughs, to survive the evening's bidding. It's worth noting that ritualized pleasure has often served administrative ends across empires. Once bodies became ledgers, rumor functioned as audit, and rumor never sleeps or forgives. Children overheard negotiations behind screens, learning that affection, like grain, could be requisitioned. What begins as spectacle ripens into policy, when repetition hardens expectations into rules. To enforce such rules, rooms must become instruments. The palace itself will do the counting. The palace learned to see curved chambers, raised couches, and corridors stitched behind tapestries. A semicircle gathered guests like a net, while the emperor sat at the sightline's apex. Whispers traveled efficiently. Heads turned together. Posture became a dial for measuring obedience. Ancient sources report hidden doors and galleries, though their details vary and invite caution. If control depends on watching, what architecture best converts glances into verdicts and policy? Screens framed entrances, encouraging staged arrivals. Alcoves let officials observe without joining the conversation. Seating mapped hierarchy with precision, making nearness to the center its own soft command. The near effect was simple. No action remained private when walls collaborated with the throne. Sound carried along plaster curves, allowing questions to land everywhere, answers nowhere to hide. Even feastware participated. Reflective metals returned faces to their owners, reminding them who watched. Note the craft here. Stage design poses as hospitality, yet hospitality enforces the stage. Once the space learned to judge, people adjusted their souls to match its angles. A city copies its palace. Builders copy their emperor. Soon, the streets will mirror these sightlines. Next comes the etiquette that makes bodies into announcements, and announcements into mandatory praise. Banquets acquired rules sharper than knives, yet soft as compliments and song. Hosts rehearsed how to admire, when to laugh, and which silences to maintain. Applause arrived on cue. Delayed clapping could read like treason in polished silver. Ancient sources differ on specifics, but agree etiquette measured loyalty with theatrical precision. When applause is rationed, who dares withhold a clap and keep tomorrow's invitation? Guests learn to present bodies like offerings. Posture corrected, eyes calibrated, smiles tax deductible. Praise traveled in rations. Shame traveled faster, drafted by glances and interrupted sentences. Seating ran like scripture. One cushion nearer meant income, contracts, and quieter creditors. The near consequence was humiliation at scale. Laundering coercion through manners and candlelight. A neutral caution. Spectacle often legitimizes policy. Laughter can notarize the cruelest paperwork. Rumor audited the night, counting stumbles, tallying stares, and pricing future access accordingly. Servants signaled outcomes with trays, while musicians disguised verdicts as modulations and reprises. By dawn, reputations rose or folded, stamped by nods, toasts, and arranged misunderstandings. Such choreography was rehearsal for a larger sacrament, marriage repurposed as imperial theater. Next, the vows themselves would bow, and sanctity would be rewritten in the palace hand. Weddings arrived radiant, then tilted, as sacred words bent toward imperial convenience. A match could be praised at noon, unstitched at dusk, then paraded as prudence. Husbands smiled with practiced courage. Wives perfected stillness that read as grateful consent. Ancient sources report different names and timings, yet converge on the public choreography. What happens to covenant when the officiant is also the empire's hungriest spectator? Rings proved malleable, divorces dissolved overnight, reunions performed like miracles sponsored by authority. Priests kept pace, blessing reversals as if doctrine simply followed the day's weather. Witnesses learned to cheer transitions, not unions, because cheering ensured their own steady roofs. The near consequence was sacrament converted into spectacle, and families converted into soft hostages. A neutral observation. Power often annexes rights first, then claims the meaning they carried. Dowries turned into bargaining chips, genealogies into leverage, compliance into a prestige accessory. Fathers weighed silence against survival, whispering courage while calculating the household's remaining seasons. Public joy masked private rupture, and the city adjusted its conscience to avoid fractures. From here, intimacy itself could be tallied like tribute, owed, scheduled, and receipted. Next, that arithmetic would harden into policy, a bodily tax with bureaucratic teeth. What began as etiquette congealed into policy, a levy assessed in breath, blush, and skin. Access became obligation, scheduled like taxes, with clerks tracking favors beside grain tallies. Ancient sources differ on mechanics, yet patterns emerge: rosters, summons, and penalties for hesitations. Who can refuse when refusal costs more than a family's winter bread and safety? Husbands negotiated time slots, pretending agency while calculating interest on imperial patience today. Mothers bartered delays with gifts, physicians' notes, and invented festivals to slow the calendar. Messengers carried sealed lists, footsteps converting intimacy into inventory before anyone could object. A neutral caution: bureaucracy preserves memory longer than rumor, and rumor already lasts lifetimes. The near consequence was predictable: shame standardized, coercion anonymized, and blame dispersed into paperwork. Household altars cooled, prayers shrank, whispered between schedules, and borrowed lullabies nightly. Neighbors practiced deliberate mishearing, protecting each other with careful, decorous inattentiveness nightly. Silk screens hid trembling, but not the ledger entries multiplying like ivy across margins. Protests migrated inward, etching cracks through faith, marriage, and the city's sense of law. Next, follow the money that kept this theater lit: stipends, bribes, benefactions, and curated piety. The empire paid for its theater with coin, contracts, and reputations converted into currency. Patronage braided with appetite. An introduction could yield shipments, offices, or gentler tax collectors. Ancient sources report gifts cataloged like treaty spoils: pearls, villas, and forgiving bookkeeping. Some accounts even speak of a sacred treasury of love, where fines became offerings. Is piety still piety when a ledger approves the kiss and tallies the perfume? Money stabilized the rituals. Games glittered. The guards stayed loyal. Bakers stayed quiet. Vendors learned the calendar of favors, arriving with figs exactly when decisions ripened. A neutral caution: economies built on proximity compress value, making distance feel like insolvency. The near consequence was inflation of attention. Louder praise required, bigger gifts necessary for entry. Courtiers mortgaged tomorrow's goodwill to purchase tonight's seat near the glittering center. Debts bred stories. Stories bred leverage. Leverage bred silence where truth might have complicated profit. Account books and rumor mills moved in parallel, both arbiters of who counted and who paid. Ancient writers disagree on totals, but agree the appetite required scaffolding no treasury could ignore. Next, step inside the minds reshaped by this market: faith shaken, vows thinning, and sleep elusive. Sleeplessness spread through polished houses. Prayers shortened. Incense burned longer than anyone admitted aloud. Some clutched amulets. Others counted auspices. A few rehearsed exits more dangerous than remaining. Ancient sources report attempts at flight and despair, though timings and motives remain contested. How does a mind pray when the altar feels co-signed by the palace itself? Physicians prescribed walks, milder wine, and hymns hummed like medicine against intrusive memory. Confessors grew careful. Friends learned to bless evasions. Letters said less while meaning more. Marriages thinned under pressure. Words clipped to avoid quarrels that listeners might monetize tomorrow. Faith, once a spine, bent into strategy. Piety measured outcomes rather than convictions. A neutral caution: prolonged coercion breeds rituals of coping that appear devotional yet anesthetize. The near consequence was moral numbness, a kindness toward survival that dulled judgment everywhere. Some sought private penance, bargaining with gods to rewind a single evening's choreography. Others hardened, choosing irony over outrage, because irony sleeps easier than fear or prayer. Rumor named these changes fashion, but the fabric was woven from exhaustion and dread. As resolve eroded, the system needed fresh enforcers, witnesses bound by pride and proximity. Next, watch how men were drafted into silence, their honor recruited to police desire. Men learned the right of witnessing: arrive, approve, and leave no sentence unfinished or strange. Nods were signatures, toasts were affidavits, presence itself notarized whatever the center required tonight. Ancient sources differ on the lists and oaths, but agree the choreography tightened relentlessly. Is silence still neutral when silence becomes the hinge on which salaries and safety turn? Hosts curated smiles like armor. Rivals praised each other publicly, banking credit against private storms. Guard captains hovered at thresholds, their patience translating into policy without a syllable spoken. A neutral observation: institutions often outsource cruelty to etiquette, so no one feels directly stained. The near consequence was fraternity repurposed. Men policed men, converting shame into a civic instrument. Jests kept sharp to slice dissent before it ripened. Laughter paved a road to obedience. Even absence became a verdict. The uninvited found creditors louder and clients suddenly shy. Boasts about proximity replaced arguments about law, and the city's vocabulary shifted accordingly. In this climate, sons watched fathers measure breaths, learning the grammar of danger by ear. They copied the pauses, the laugh lengths, the safer adjectives for perilous evenings ahead. From such lessons, childhood narrowed into training, and training blurred into complicity by habit. Next, the children stepped from doorways into history. Witnesses first, and sometimes, heartbreakingly, participants. Children learned doorways first: where to stand, when to vanish, how to hear safely. Games adapted, chalk lines mapped corridors. Marbles marked which rooms carried storms tonight. Nurses traded lullabies for coded warnings. Older cousins patrolled silence like dutiful sentries. Ancient writers differ on specifics, yet agree the little ones watched more than spoke. How does a child chart safety when adults redraw the borders every glittering hour? They practiced agreeable faces, learning to nod without promising, to laugh without inviting questions. Lessons etched deep, trust rationed, sleep shallow, and privacy treated like contraband in cupboards. Some were paraded as ornaments, praised loudly, then returned to rooms that hummed with dread. A neutral caution: exposure rehearses outcomes. Rehearsal becomes habit. Habit can masquerade as character. The near consequence was adulthood narrowed. Marriage negotiated like truce. Devotion measured against alarms. Faith bent toward bargains, asking gods for postponements rather than miracles or mended vows. Siblings became quiet diplomats, smoothing quarrels before servants could convert them into currency. Where tenderness should have rooted, strategy germinated. Where certainty should hold, improvisation stood trembling. Childhood thus trained supplied tomorrow's elite, fluent in danger, gifted at graceful evasions. From such households, the pattern traveled outward, catching rides with officials bound for provinces. Next, watch governors and legates copy the palace, exporting etiquette as an instrument of rule. Provincial capitals learned the script: processions, curated feasts, and invitations heavy with implied arithmetic. Governors arranged sightlines like sermons. Legates rehearsed compliments as carefully as winter logistics. Ancient sources disagree on scope and zeal, yet confirm imitation as the safest policy. What do provinces copy first? The rituals of nearness, or the mercy that should accompany power? Prefects priced audiences, clients queued with figs, legal briefs, and strategic apologies pre-written. Garrisons enforced calendars, escorting messengers who carried rumor as faithfully as imperial dispatches. A neutral observation: imitation reduces risk upward while multiplying damage sideways, touching every household threshold. The near consequence was governance by humiliation. Access granted for performance, withheld to punish hesitation. Market squares hosted verdicts disguised as spectacles. Theater bled into taxation in temple seasons. Commanders learned that laughter travels faster than edicts, and sometimes cuts even deeper. Provincial poets trimmed their tongues. Magistrates balanced budgets with praise rather than prudent arithmetic. Distance did not dilute the choreography. It standardized it, like coin, dies, and marching pace. Thus the empire wore a single mask, fitted in Rome, fastened in distant courtyards. Imitation, however, craves a larger stage. It soon reached beyond palaces into arenas. Next, step into the public glare where punishment performs, and crowds learn obedience by cheering. Crowds gathered beneath awnings as magistrates paced the stage, rehearsing expressions calibrated for mercy. Condemnations arrived with drums, trumpet flourishes, and careful pauses that taught the audience when to shudder. Vendors sold dates and stories, because a spectacle without commentary rarely reaches its political destination. Ancient sources describe executions paired with games, though details flit and conflict like birds above marble. When punishment becomes theater, what lesson does the crowd learn besides obedience wrapped in applause? Choreographed humiliation trained neighborhoods, mapping fault lines and converting anxiety into manageable, taxable civic energy. It is worth noting that public penalties often pass as instruction, baptizing fear as communal virtue. The near consequence was clear: gossip standardized verdicts, and verdicts standardized behavior even without new statutes. Children repeated chants at play, while adults echoed them during taxes, trials, and oaths at altars. Praetorians studied faces the way accountants study columns, calculating risk, loyalty, and billable intimidation. As cheers turned habitual, senators discovered applause could be measured, priced, and deducted like patronage. From that arena, the choreography marched inward, entering the Senate where praise became administrative oxygen. Senators gathered with polished tablets and faces, drafting speeches that would sound spontaneous by noon. Clerks placed names by proximity, and proximity determined who laughed first, longest, and last. Motion after motion praised efficiency, piety, and moderation, unmoored from budgets, case law, or grain reserves. Ancient authors differ on roll calls and penalties, yet agree reluctance carried a price payable in careers. Who speaks truth when truth competes against stipends, security details, and invitations that feed entire households? It bears noting that ceremonial praise can drain institutions, leaving procedures intact while courage evaporates quietly. The near consequence was institutional hollowness. Votes passed, records flourished, and policy deferred to private theater. Senators calculated exits, courted guards, and wrote wills with discreet clauses about anticipated misunderstandings. Applause lingered into corridors. Meanwhile, the guard adjusted rosters to escort and curate every evening. Rivalries outsourced themselves to watch rotations where proximity could rescue reputations or ruin adversaries overnight. From this chamber of polished ascent, step into the barracks where logistics learned to choreograph desire. The guard learned a new craft, choreographing nearness, escort, and curated disappearance on command. Rosters expanded with names, addresses, and discreet notes on temper, debts, and pliability. Courtyards became checkpoints where passwords changed nightly and couriers carried invitations like arrest warrants. Ancient sources diverge on procedures, yet agree the barracks and boudoir began sharing a calendar. What is protection when the route itself is a message, announcing favor before breath or sentence? Escorts lingered at doorways, not quite inside, translating pauses into policy without reporting a syllable. Officers tracked candle hours, ensuring arrivals overlapped conveniently, and departures proved unambiguously satisfied and grateful. A neutral caution: logistics tends to moralize itself, calling efficiency what is actually managed fear. The near consequence was bureaucratic intimacy, where preference mutated into paperwork and paperwork authorized preference. Ledgers audited embraces by sequence, duration, and witnesses, like quartermasters inventorying ladders and salt. Guards traded small mercies, detours, warnings, delays, for promises that could be collected tomorrow morning. If someone disappeared from lists, creditors grew brave, and petitioners learned inconvenient facts very quickly. The city adjusted door hinges and gossip routes, accommodating the empire's newest, quietest instrument. With mechanisms humming, the narrative itself became a weapon, and poems sharpened like daggers overnight. Next, watch how rumor, epigram, and accusation trained the empire to obey stories before laws. Rome has two currencies, coin and story often purchases what coin cannot reach. Satirists murmured epigrams that traveled faster than edicts, braided into gossip like garlands. Ancient accounts named pamphlets, lampoons, and scandal verses pinned to statues at night. Officials collected them at dawn, but absence proved publicity, gifting rumors longer legs. When suppression guarantees circulation, who benefits from outrage more, the author or the target? Courtiers rehearsed denial with wounded elegance, then commissioned rival stories dressed in borrowed sanctity. Bedrooms became press rooms. Pillows sourced quotations. Servants edited copy by closing certain doors. A neutral observation: narrative control taxes memory, making forgetfulness feel like virtue and patriotism. The near consequence was reputational hunger. Everyone sought witnesses, alibis, and signatures before conversation began. Poets purchased immunity with flattery. Historians bartered chronology for access and dinners near warmth. Some swore the emperor managed both scripts, staging scandals to trap rivals inside applause. Ancient sources disagree on orchestration, yet agree that story and shrine began to converge. If virtue could be narrated, why not enthrone it, stamp it, and invoice it? The stage thus turned toward temples, where marble promised meaning that etiquette alone could not. Next, enter the sanctuaries where divinity is drafted as policy, and policy as sacrament. Marble learned new grammar as altars welcomed the emperor beside gods, not beneath. Processions lengthened, incense thickened, decrees braided devotion with law calling obedience a sacred duty. Priests revised calendars to fit birthdays, epithets, and radiate crowns stamped across coinage. Ancient sources report ceremonies differently, yet converge on worship promoted from courtesy to examination. Oaths named his genius, choirs rehearsed hymns, magistrates timed applause like precise navigational stars. Is reverence still reverence when failure to genuflect redraws property lines and prison doors? Shrines multiplied across provinces, ensuring loyalty could be audited far from Rome's immediate glare. Processions codified proximity, assigning steps, banners, and incense weights proportional to favor. A neutral observation. Sacralizing authority often immunizes excess, because contradiction sounds like blasphemy. Petitions entered temples first, then offices, as if divinity pre-approved administrative appetite. Sculptors learned policy, chiseling mercy onto marble features that demanded increasingly total performances. Rumor adapted its liturgy, praising miracles that sounded suspiciously like logistics wearing perfume. The near consequence was simple. Disagreement reclassified as impiety, punishable without need for dossiers. From such sanctuaries, knives gathered courage, and conspiracies searched corridors between incense and applause. The calendar turned to the 24th of January, year 41, by Roman counting. Games had ended, corridors steamed with breath. Officials dispersed along routes everyone considered safe. In a passage near the theaters, steel appeared where compliments usually traveled without friction. Ancient sources disagree on rooms and order, yet name officers whose patience finally shattered. A shout cracked the hallway, another followed. The choreography inverted with terrifying, irreversible clarity. Is loyalty more brittle than fear when both have been rehearsed for years without interruption? The guard split, some stunned, some complicit, and some calculating futures faster than blood cooled. Courtiers scattered through storerooms and gardens, clutching ledgers, amulets, and plausible alibis rehearsed nightly. The city inhaled rumor, doors latched. Scribes sharpened dates that would outlive witnesses. A neutral caution. Coups rewrite memory first, then laws, collapsing nuance and self-protective narrative. Bodies were hidden, displayed, or both, depending on which message commanders needed before dusk. The near consequence was vacuum. Power slipping sideways, asking shrines and swords to authorize succession. In that vacuum, a family scrambled, a senate postured, and a guard negotiated destiny. From the assassination's echo, we moved to erasure, silence, and the accounting that followed. Erasure followed the knives, deliberate as audit, quiet as incense settling after procession. Names were scratched from pedestals, faces softened, then hammered blank by civic piety. Coins learned new portraits, decrees learned corrections, statues learned to leave no convenient shadows, archivists trimmed ledgers, closed boxes, and misfiled afternoons until patterns dissolved into dust. Ancient sources disagree on who ordered what, yet agree that forgetting became a policy. Who authors history when witnesses are bruised into silence and clerks are paid per omission? Families practiced amnesia, adopting careful smiles that kept creditors calm and neighbors disinclined to pry. Lawyers drafted pardons, jurists explained necessity, senators promised a steadier weather tomorrow if obeyed. Priests repainted offerings, renamed festivals, and tucked uncomfortable legends behind newer, scented narratives. The near consequence was structural silence, easier budgets, smoother votes, and shallower consciences citywide. Children grew fluent in forgetting, a grammar rewarded with safer doorways and uninspected cupboards. Yet cracks remained where truth whispered, catching on masonry like wind behind theater curtains. From these cracks we gather the consequences, then ask the question our century must answer next. Look back along the corridors we walked, feasts, thresholds, barracks, and altars braided together. Where desire became policy, decency bent. Where worship became law, dissent blurred into profanity. The first consequence is intimate and immediate. Bodies were conscripted, and consent lost semantic shelter. The second consequence is institutional. Praise replaced deliberation, and courage relocated to anonymous whispers. The third consequence is civic. Silence professionalized, making forgetfulness feel prudent, patriotic, and strangely polite. Do empires fail suddenly or gradually, one standing ovation at a time, notarized by etiquette? Ancient sources disagree on motives and minutiae, yet agree the choreography crushed truth into performance. When people perform to survive, institutions record the performance and forget the price of tickets. Near at hand, we inherit a warning. Guardrails must defend bodies before they defend pride. Farther out, we inherit a task: demand laws that outstare charisma and outlast rumor. Because if virtue becomes theater, who decides the script when power changes masks again? From this silence, open the next door carefully. Decide how a city should measure reverence.